The views and opinions expressed during Love and Life with Lana and Dave are those only of the speakers and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or the position of our podcast hosts or affiliates. Any content provided is not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, anyone, or anything. All right, let's do it.
You're listening to Love and Life with Lana and Dave, the podcast where logic is power and you take control. Thank you for tuning in and making the choice to listen in and get ideas for your own love and life. Now, here are your hosts, Lana Williams and David Vaccaro.
Hey, y'all. Happy September. We're starting to run into the middle of September, and we ended up getting this heat wave, which is pretty funny because I think the beginning of the summer we had a heat wave. This is Lana with you. At the beginning of the summer we had sort of a heat wave. I remember that, and then sort of like rain, and we did have a lot of nice days, a lot of like warm days, and then September came in somehow. We got this heat wave at the beginning of September, so waiting for that to kind of go away, waiting for the fire pit weather, this sweatshirt hoodie weather, the kind of fall jacket, the leaves falling, kind of waiting for that to happen, which is any day now. I mean, the leaves are already coming down. So yeah, it's that time of year. So I am rolling through this Reminisce sort of series that we're doing here. And last week we talked about music, and I use that as a topic. It's just like a way to remember, what we think we appreciate about the past. And sometimes we may see the past in a specific way or in a biased way, something that's biased to what we prefer, what we enjoy, and maybe the concept that not everybody remembers things the way that we do, and there are things that happened in the past that worked really well for us. Sometimes they did not work well for others. Maybe they didn't work well for others and we benefited from that. It all depends on what the situation is. But with music, it's very subjective to what it is that you enjoyed as a kid. As human beings, we all tend to be biased towards our childhood and specific goalposts in our life or specific milestones in our life where something is incredibly poignant to us, and maybe complete nightmare for someone else to listen to the same stuff that we are listening to and thinking that's the best stuff ever. Someone else may be listening to it and thinking it's absolutely horrible. It's going to just depend on the person, what it reminds them of, how old they are, how ingrained in them this particular thing is that they're remembering. So in this particular part of the series, I just wanted to bring up some of the social issues, and this is going to be a riff, right? So I'm not really going on specific statistics. I'm just kind of going based on, what we've learned as people in history, kind of trying to throw some logic in there, right? So this would be the logic of reminiscing and then social issues being the subtopic of this particular podcast. So I guess we can start with the 50s and say that, there was a point in time where life was very different. It was I use the word patriarchal society because it really was. I mean, there was a point in time where it's nothing like it used to be, but women were second-class citizens. There were a lot of things that women couldn't do. Women, didn't have the same types of opportunities occupationally as men had or financially as men had, And so going through like the 50s and the 60s and even part of the 70s, there are people out there that are going to tell you that, those are the good old days. But the good old days is a very subjective term, right? So what does that mean? There were, and I'm going to say this as a balance of scale. So for every point in time where something seemed to be really good, there was always a downside to that, right? Nothing was ever all good or all bad. There was always good and bad in every era and all kinds of past history for people. So there may be things that were good for those people, but not so good for other people. So somebody that may say, well, this is the good old days, the 50s, the 60s. When people fell in love and it really meant something, that might be a cliche term that somebody brings up now that might be in their 30s or 40s and really wasn't alive back in the 50s. And I'm sure there's a lot of romanticized stuff on TV where you'll think, well, the 50s were great. I mean, look at all the things that we did. Well, Yes, but we were a lot more provincial in the stuff that we had around us. We had no knowledge of future technology. As much as things got better after the 50s, of course they were the best for us at that time, but we also didn't know from more sophisticated or more technological or anything futuristic. We didn't know, right? So it's very easy to look back and say, well, I can compare today to 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, but you can't really compare yourself in the time that you're in to the future because you just don't have any concept of the future. So the only thing I can think of that would make sense is that somebody says like, well, I married a person who wasn't right for me, but at least I had these kids that I have, and I don't know what I do without my kids. But it's a phrase that's sort of like in a vacuum, in the sense that if they didn't have their kids, they would just live how they normally did. There was really no comparison, because if they didn't, much like string theory, it's just a fork in the road. And wherever you are, you can't imagine yourself on the other side of that, just because like there's no concept of that. You have the historical step-by-step process of the period of time that you're in, and you can't see it any other way. I mean, the only time you see movies, it's kind of like a joke. You see movies like Back to the Future or like Sliding Doors, where somebody's living out two specific scenarios simultaneously, because it's so hard to understand that you cannot grasp. You can look at your life before you had a child, and then really, if you think about it, that's really what your life would be, right? Except you did have a child, right? So then you can't imagine how your life would be without that person. But to say that is almost proof of the fact that you couldn't imagine your life without them, because that's not what happened. You know what I mean? So again, just doing my thing where I pull apart phrases that kind of don't make sense to me. People say things all the time. I ask myself, are they listening to what they're saying? Because, of course, your concept of somebody, especially from birth to whatever age it is that your child is, that's all you know. And you can't imagine not having them because you didn't take that path in life. So anyway, in the 50s, life was a certain way. There were, as a woman, I have to say that, it wasn't the best for women. However, it was also to some degree not something that women didn't know otherwise. I mean, of course, there were women who didn't appreciate where they were and they weren't happy with where they were. And there's plenty of movies and books about that. Feminine Mystique would be one of them. And that'd be Betty Friedan. That there's a book from somebody who said, hey, we're doing this thing that we're supposed to be doing, but like, is this what we want? That was kind of the idea of the Feminine Mystique. Was, okay, we grew up, we got married, we had children, our husbands are off to work, we're home, we're doing Tupperware parties, or I'm not sure in the 50s if Tupperware parties existed. I think they did, or something similar. We're all going to each other's houses, we're trading recipes, that kind of thing. We're raising our children as a village, which I'll talk about later. But, is this what we want? Is this, as women, what we're meant to do? What if we don't want to do this? Now what do we do? Especially if we're ingrained into a point where, okay, we've come this far. We've got like 2 children and we've got this house and our husband's off to work. And, we're sitting at the table in the kitchen thinking, is this my life? That's kind of what the Feminine Mystique is. There's a lot more to it. There's a darker side of it, as I would say that birth control is kind of a thing that spun everything on its head, especially back then. And the other thing was sending women to work when men were at war. That was another very big turning point that you can't really take back. You couldn't take back the birth control. You couldn't take back the Rosie the Riveter thing. Those were 2 things that happened that once the war was won and men came home, women were like, well, no, wait a minute. I was off working while you were doing what you were doing. I was off working. And to be honest with you, I can't go back and become a housewife. Again, I can never speak for everybody and say that they all wanted the same thing. But I'm just saying that there were a lot of women who were housewives because that was what they were born and raised and trained to do by their parents and their community. And then when they went off to work, they said, hey, here's something I didn't think of. And now that I've been doing this for a while, I don't really want to not do it. I now no longer want to be where I'm at. Again, some housewives were happy to go back to just being housewives. Some were like, absolutely not. I don't want to ever do that again. I realized that's not what I wanted. So you don't know from your options until you have them, right? So that's the 50s. And there's all kinds of stuff that go on there. The GI Bill that came through and the way the workforce was back then, where the economy was a certain way and structure of society was a certain way, and men would go off to work. Really, they would, not all of them, of course. Life was different back then as well, where there were a lot of people that did live in the city, but there were also suburban streets and families and things like that. That kind of came with the GI Bill and a lot of things that had happened with housing, and it's a very long story. But men would get in the car, they would drive to the bus station, they would get on the bus, they would go downtown to work, they would work for however many hours, they would get back to the bus station or back to the train station, go back to their cars, get in their cars and drive home, and, kind of dinner was on the table and the children were all, had all come back from school and done their homework and they're in front of the TV, and that was kind of life back then. We had an economy that supported that. There's a lot of reasons why that isn't the case anymore, but at one point that was the way that it was. And life changed for very many reasons. Like, society changes and it morphs and it turns and it does different things. So if you kind of look at the whole picture and not just the part that you like, well, I really miss, if somebody was living in the 50s, I really miss the 50s because, and I'll bring this back because I was going to say something about this earlier, that children were being raised by a community. Men went off and worked and women stayed home and nurtured, and children, there was a huge street full of children and mothers were home all day, that kind of thing. That was very good for children, and that's okay. However, the other side of that is that, yes, there were women that were home all day and had their children and were doing things around the house, but that maybe didn't want that kind of life. That wasn't what, once they were in it, and you have to remember, as you're a child, as you get older, your brain is developing and the things that you want to do are kind of coming into focus. So back in the 50s, it was a very different view as far as getting married. You would get married extremely young. So there's a bunch of things going on, starting with most of the prospects that you would marry would be within your community. And I'm talking a very small community. It would be a neighborhood. Maybe you'd meet some people across town that knew people that you knew, every so often. On certain occasions, you'd go to a bar or a club or a restaurant sort of that was regional to you and run into people from other neighborhoods that were close by. But for the most part, you had a very small circle in the 50s. There wasn't a whole lot of communication outside of a specific area. So if you met people, they were not always, but pretty common that people that you met and dated and married were people that you knew of or you heard of, or they had an indirect connection to your neighborhood and your society and your circle of people. There's a lot of reasons why that's different. And I've gotten into this in podcasts before, so I'm not going to go crazy about it. But that's one factor of the 50s. Keeping children in neighborhoods and raising them as a village, that wasn't actually a very, very advantageous time for children. You could be married and you had the father that went off to work and came home. And because of that life, the women living in the house and the men that were off to work had very different personalities or very different environments that they were in all day. So to be honest, they weren't really relatable to each other. And that's not to say that they didn't get along or that they didn't love each other or anything like that. But because of the smallness of the neighborhood and the smallness of the circle that you would take your prospect from, and I meant to mention this earlier, you really had to be married by a certain time in the 50s. There was like sort of a taboo to you being too old to be married, which doesn't happen anymore. It was almost, I don't want to say ironic, but it was almost an advantage to be married before you had the ability to realize that you didn't want to do that. And I'm not saying that was the reason people did it, but the side effect of being married before you were in your mid-20s, which was really in the 50s what the stigma was. If you got to be 23, 24, 25 as a woman, you were like beyond marriage age at that point, which is unheard of in this day and age. It was unheard of when I was a kid. But that's how it was. You wanted to be married and start having your kids like when you were at college age. That was like what everybody expected of you. People expected you not to go to college, but if you did, and if somebody wants to look up Wellesley College, you'll see it in the 50s and 60s at Wellesley College. You really learned a lot of liberal stuff, like as far as liberal arts and a lot of electives and things like that. But a lot of the courses in Wellesley and some other schools like that were courses in how to take care of the house and make sure your husband was fed and, entertain guests and all that kind of stuff. It was a lot of Emily Post and a lot of, how to balance books on your head. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that women did in college back then. If they did go to school, those courses were interlaced. So it's like, all right, well, you get a degree, but your degree was going to have a whole lot of housekeeping enlaced in it. And it was just the way that colleges were for women at that time. And women also had there was a point in time where women going to school or going off to school and living in dorms, that was like, not saying that there wasn't any co-ed, but it wasn't as much co-ed as it is now. It was an all-women's school, an all-man school, that kind of thing happened. So you had to be married pretty young, so you really didn't have enough life experience to know that you didn't want to be doing what you were doing. You were raised to, this was it. You were going to find a husband by the time you were, 18, 19, 20, have a couple of kids by the time you're 25, and really, at 25 is when you really develop your personality entirely and become a whole person. So it's before you're really able to make your decisions on what it is that you want to do with your life, that your life's already mapped out for you, and it starts 5 years before that. And it's just, it's just coincidental that it just so happens to be way too late by the time you decide that that's not what you want to do. And that did happen in a lot of households. So when you look back at the past, like I mentioned with Woodstock, Woodstock was this beautiful, if you talk to anybody that went to Woodstock, or if you look at Woodstock as a concept, it was this peace, love, beautiful music. Everybody was happy. It was this big, huge musical event in the 60s, but there was a lot of downside to the Woodstock Festival that nobody talks about, or nobody wants to talk about, or people forgot about, or people ignored. And so with the 50s, it's the same in the 60s, it's the same kind of thing. So the upside was, yes, the family structure was a certain way, but there was a lot of downside. I think there were a lot of people who didn't really relate to their fathers as kids that grew up in the 50s because their fathers were working all the time and they were tired and they didn't have any interest in relating to the children that much when they were home. Maybe they'd see their dads on the weekends. During the week, their dads were too tired or too frustrated or, too zoned out to really have quality time with them. And that would have been normal back in the 50s. When you think about it, you really need some more bonding time. Whereas, as much as you're a married couple now in today's day and age, there's still that concept of, the husband and wife live in the house and the wife takes care of the children, the husband helps. But really, that's just the way that you would look at it. Technically, both parents should have hands-on in the relationship and with their kids. Nobody's helping because both people are parents and both people are responsible. But there's that stigma. And back in the 50s, it was extremely prevalent that women were just the ones taking care of the children. It was just their issue. And guys came and went and did their thing. There was also, because it was such a very different environment in the 50s and 60s, where men were out for work all day, and there was I call the Madonna whore complex, which happens a lot regardless of what time you live in, but where men somehow or other may have lost, sexual attraction to their wives because their wives became mothers, and because they were so far removed from their wives all the time, because they were, it sounds silly, but a commute both ways every single day during the week, that was like an extra hour or two maybe that they could have been home, but they drove to the train and got on the train and went downtown. So there was a lot of bonding while they were commuting with other guys. There was a lot of bonding or a lot of male bonding going on trains and that kind of stuff. But for the most part, there's 2 hours out of the day they could have spent with someone else, but they were too busy trying to get to work and trying to get back from work and being late from work and all that kind of stuff. A lot of men had affairs as well, because they spent so much time at the office that they ended up very close with their secretaries who they saw all the time. That was kind of the attitude back then, right? And I'm going to roll into some other stuff, but for the most part, women, once, the war ended, once World War II ended, there were a lot of women who went to work and decided they were never going to go back to be housewives again. And I guess you can look at it like, well, it's too bad that they left the house and found that out. I'm sure a lot of people thought that it was ruined for them, but it became hey, why can't women work? Why Why are we home with the children? Is this what we're meant to do? Some women wanted to be mothers and wives, and that was their thing. And even to this day, that's a thing. And I'm a feminist, but I'm a feminist that believes that whoever in the relationship, if there's two people that are together and there's something they want to both do and it works for them in their family, in their life, and they're not hurting anybody and it's not illegal, they're not disrupting society with something, with debauchery or whatever you want to call it, that's fine. So if in 2023, there are women who want to be housewives and there are men who want housewives. And I think that's great. I think that if those two people run into each other, that's fantastic. And I think that's what they should do. I also believe that there are women who want to be CEOs and they want to be VPs and they want to make 6 figures, 7 figures. They want to take care of themselves. They want to pay their own way, whatever it is. I think between two people, if they're getting what they need to get done and that both of them agree to how they want to live. So if a woman is making 7 figures and she's got a husband who wants to stay home and watch children, if she has those children, that's fantastic. That works for the two of them. I don't have any judgment about any of that. I don't know why I would. So my problem with what I want to say, the misconstruing of feminism is that, yes, there should be equal opportunity. There are some gray areas and some careers where there's not necessarily equal opportunity, or it can't be equal across the board just for specific things, physicalities and things like that. But, at the end of the day, it's about choice to me. It is about what does this woman choose to do? And as long as she's making the choice to do it, then she should be allowed to go the path and choose to do it. And she's not hurting anybody and she wants to do her thing. If that is to be an astronaut, then she should have the opportunity to be an astronaut. And if it takes specific schooling or specific smarts or specific grades or whatever the case may be, then she should be able to go the distance. And if she fails, she fails. And if she gets what she wants, she gets what she wants. Nobody should really, though, get in her way because she's a woman and say, well, you can't be an astronaut because women aren't astronauts. That's my problem. I have a problem with that. I think that as long as a woman wants to do something, the opportunity should be there for her to try to do it. Period. By the same token, if you are a 7-figure CEO and you're a woman who is, there should be no shade or no disrespect to women who don't want to be 7-figure CEOs. What you want to do is not what everyone else wants to do. So there should be some form of respect for your peers and what they choose to do. That's kind of where my issue always has been. And, I've heard the phone calls that Gloria Steinem's gotten in interviews where people are just calling her and telling her she's ruining the family unit. No, she's not ruining the family unit. All, in my opinion, she's ever tried to do was make sure that women had a voice, women had choices to make, and that they weren't being shut out of those choices. They were giving the opportunity to do something. And if she was a woman, that was no reason to stop her from doing that thing, period. And I believe the same. So I don't think housewives should give VIPs and CEOs a bunch of bullshit, and nor should I think that CEOs or VIPs or VPs should be giving housewives any bullshit, because both of those things are important and neither one of those things is better than the other. Those are things that those women choose to do. And you can talk to me about that if you have a problem with it. But I don't think when somebody comes to me and says, well, feminism is ruining the family unit, I always like to say, well, let's talk about the family unit, because in the 50s, the family unit, it looked really good. On Life magazine, it looked really good when you watch Davy and Goliath, and Leave It to Beaver and all that kind of stuff, which was, by the way, model television. But in real life, there was abuse, there was drinking, there were men who were cheating on their wives, there were women who didn't want to be where they were. There were a lot of different things going on that society didn't talk about. Everything was hush-hush. Very taboo things were happening. And so it isn't all as glamorous as people look back and reminisce and say it is. And as far as I'm concerned, the gritty underside of anything, any era, should be discussed. There should be no reason it gets swept under the rug or we don't discuss it. That's how we come up with these biased reminiscing of times that were a specific way in our heads and not necessarily accurate as far as like what was actually happening. So that's that. And then the 60s, a lot of things happen. There was a lot of, civil rights and feminism. These are all things of people that were second-class citizens that decided that they didn't want to be anymore and they didn't need to be anymore. And people that were basically arguing that they should stay second-class citizens. That was really what the 60s was about, let's be honest. It did erupt into a lot of chaos and craziness and that sort of thing. But for a very long time, women didn't work. It wasn't until the 70s that women started to have financial leverage and were able to open bank accounts and have credit cards. And, it's kind of a joke, but not. There was this one episode of Sex and the City where in the 90s, might have been the 90s. Yeah, I think it was the 90s, the late 90s, when Miranda's buying an apartment in New York. And it's like the entire episode is people asking her, so it's just you? It seems like a joke, but there was a point in time where we all heard that all the time. If if you're by yourself and you're not moving in with some guy, like everybody's mystified by this. And somebody who was a lawyer, which basically was her career. Again, it was a show, so obviously we're just talking about fiction, but the concept of having enough money to buy an apartment in New York and knowing what you were doing and saying, I'm going to do this. This is my thing. And having just everybody all the way down the line question that. So you're just going to do this? Even Charlotte, who was the Pollyanna of the show, saying, well, if you buy an apartment, you're not leaving yourself any room for societal relationships. You shouldn't ever own because then you want to meet a guy and buy a place with him. And so if you've already bought a place before you meet a guy, then you've shut yourself out of that path. That's this old fashioned way of thinking. You need to rent apartments and live with your parents and all these kind of things because men are the ones that buy real estate, and you don't really want to do something as serious, buy an apartment or a house or property until you're with someone else. That's some kind of, it's a holdover from the 50s and 60s and maybe even 70s that women buying something on their own was questionable. Oh, you've put yourself in a corner there, and now you could have dated and had a perfect relationship, but now you've shot yourself in the foot on that by buying property. So anyway, that's close to 2000 that episode aired, and it really wasn't. It was way better than it was in the 60s and 70s, but it really wasn't something that didn't continue to happen in that point in time when it was almost the year 2000. That was still a frustrating thing that women were going through. I'm sure it still kind of is now, but not as much as it used to be. There's a lot of people that have done a lot of things and nobody questions it anymore, but it took a while for that to kind of go away. So you get into the 60s, the late 60s and the early 70s, which was, the Vietnam War and the hippie generation, and they were just anti. At one point, it's always good as a teenager to become anti some sort of thing. And so all through time, there was always a group of people that were just against the establishment, right? And you can go back pretty far, but if you stay with the 70s, it's they were anti-commercial, anti-establishment, anti anything that had to do with structure. So there was a real good amount of music that came from that is amazing. There was a lot of drugs that were taken in the 70s and things like that. But, for the most part, we were protesting a lot of things in the 70s that were holdovers. Some of them were holdovers from the 60s, and the Vietnam War was one of them. The Vietnam War started in the 60s. So there were a lot of things that the hippies protested in the 70s, and one of them was the fact that, the Vietnam War was a bloody war. There were a lot of people we were over there killing. Some people will argue that the war was it didn't have enough for what we were doing. The purpose of the war was unclear, unjustified. It was a war that didn't need to happen. It depends on who you talk to. And then when our veterans came back, I don't care. We had an American military. There were a lot of people who did not want to go to war in the 70s and the 60s and 70s for the Vietnam War for several reasons. But, one of them was that they didn't, there was a point in time where the draft was in, and that was where you were pulled by, I believe it was birthday. I don't honestly, and it's terrible, I don't know for sure, but I believe it had to do with birthdays. They would just lottery, and guys would have to go. They were very young. They shouldn't have been, some of them that shouldn't have been there as young as they were. And it was pretty traumatizing for a lot of them. And the Vietnam War was not fought, let's just say, in a way that made sense to us. They were just looking to They were looking to get to win any way they had to. And so they did a lot of underhanded stuff, and they put a lot of their own family in jeopardy to ambush us, things like that. So the people that came back from the war were very messed up from that. They were young when they went in. A lot of them had drugs available to them in the 70s over there. They had drugs that they could take, and a lot of them decided to do that because they didn't really like being there. They weren't happy with the situation. They had to do their tours and came back, and, a lot of stuff came back with veterans, and a lot of them had some serious issues from what they had been through and what they had seen and that sort of thing. So there's a very long story about that. But when they did come back, because of the protests of the war, I personally disagree with how veterans were treated. They were drafted, they went, they didn't have any choice. And when they came back, we had a problem with them being over there fighting that war. So we took it out on them, and they, on top of everything else that they went through during that war, they had to come back. And I feel like being treated like they came back to be treated like shit, which that's always upset me. I was real young when all of that happened. So I can't say that I had much to do with it other than like I knew about it because I still wasn't 10 years old, but that sucks. That's absolutely horrible to do to people. There's some human beings that went over to the Vietnam War and came back, and their entire lives were ruined for what? And that was an unfair thing. I mean, a lot of them were just, I'm telling you, from the time they were 16 or 17, and went through and got drafted and all that, and were over there. I think 19 was the youngest age, or the typical age of people who were drafted over there, from 19 to their 30s or whatever it was, because the war went on for a little while. When those people came back, they were really no good at that point. They had been too far gone with a lot of stuff that they had dealt with trauma wise to be functional adults. And when you think about that, that's absolutely devastating and sad that this is something that, that America asked them to do. And this is the way that they lived. So there's that, but that was part of the backdrop of those times, including the civil rights and things like Brown versus Board of Education and white flight, and there were all kinds of things that went on in the 60s and 70s for, in my opinion, people who were trying to progress and people who didn't want to see that happen. The piece of the pie theory of if you gain, I lose, and that's always what seems to be going on at least within this country, when that types of things happen. And then rolling into the 80s, it's kind of like, there was, I guess on one hand, there was this, whole decadence Wall Street thing that went on. And you'll hear all about that if you watch a couple of movies. You'll kind of get the gist. But the beginning of the 80s really wasn't very glamorous. It was, it was kind of Ronald Reagan, and there were parts of it. There were a lot of things that changed industrially. A lot of neighborhoods that changed. We had something called Reaganomics. There were a lot of people in inner cities that were really like not eating and didn't have jobs, and that kind of stuff went on in the beginning of the 80s. And it did change after a while. When we got into the 90s, it really wasn't so bad. But how we changed societally, there was a lot of, in the 70s, we had a lot of what we call free love, where people were just like, it was almost like don't get me wrong, people did get into relationships and they were involved and they were exclusive, but there were a lot of people who sort of didn't think that they needed to be restricted, being that there were so many people that were hippies that were sort of anti-establishment. They were also anti-tradition. And so they were trying to get out of that box of we need to stay with one person and be with one person. So there was a lot of free love going around in the 70s. And there were also some drugs. And when you kind of mix those things together with the music, everybody was having a good time. But for the most part, it was, we're going to love and have fun with whoever's there. There's actually a song called if you can't be with the one you love the one you with, and that wasn't a complete anthem for the 70s, but it really was indicative of the mindset of that time. And so that's kind of a theme song for that era. And we got into the 80s and things changed, and we almost went through at one point kind of a safe sex era where it was almost a backlash to the free love era, was like the safe sex era where we all had to be have condomed up and birth controlled up, and because there was a point in time where the free love of the 70s didn't, eventually became a problem where we had to say, okay, well, we're going to start having sex is great, but we're going to have to start watching what we're doing. So, and the AIDS epidemic began. The AIDS epidemic put a lot of people, that the brakes went on a lot of stuff when that happened. And it was pretty serious. But there were all kinds of things basically that happened in different eras and different decades that, one, were a factor of technology and improvement, things that, progressed as time went on. And other things were reactions to previous things. And so, you'll see things in history where this happened and then this thing happened to counteract this thing. So you look at free love and then you see the safe sex movement. Well, one was a complete reaction to the other. We went too far in one direction, so we had to kind of correct ourselves by going in the other direction. And that's the pendulum, that swings. So I see a pendulum that was, when I was a kid, it was highly patriarchal, and that was where the pendulum was sitting, or at least before I was born, it was sitting heavily to that side, and that would have been the 50s and 60s. And then it started to swing, and as I started to get older, it started to swing into the middle, where you started to see things like civil rights and start to see things like feminism, and hey, we're all people that don't really want to be in this box where everything's defined, because there are so many people outside the box, and the defined doesn't allow for people that don't fit in those boxes. And so things change. So we're swinging in what I think is a highly matriarchal direction. Don't get me wrong. There is still patriarchy, and patriarchy is trying really hard to hold on. And I don't agree or disagree. Well, I'll disagree with it in the sense that I'm a woman. And so to some degree, patriarchal holding on is going to affect me. So I don't like that, but I'm not surprised by that. And logically, it makes sense that would be the reaction. It would just be the reaction. Like, oh, if you listen to some guys, they'll tell you that they're being extinguished. They feel like they're being ostracized or becoming a minority, which I'll just say is interesting, because if women are a minority, or if homosexuals were a minority or whatever, it's all good and fine when you're not care about those who are. But when you become a minority, it's scary, and it's scary because you see what minorities go through. So I'll just say that, and I'll leave it at that. But it definitely, the world changing and doing things, and you look at technological advances, and we get into this day and age, and I'll say that when I graduated high school, like, I think my generation was the last generation there were women who got degrees when starting from Wellesley and all the way up there, women who went to school and got degrees. And don't get me wrong, there were women who went to school, they became journalists, it's not like women didn't get into careers, but the majority of women who graduated, they may have gotten a career, but it was like a fallback almost. It wasn't what they were doing. It was almost like, well, if I marry this guy and it doesn't work out, or I am going to marry this guy and then pursue this thing. But it wasn't like a priority for them when I was growing up. It was an addition to whatever your goal was, and your goal was generally family oriented. There were not a lot of women who weren't looking to come out of high school and just completely not deal with men and just go after some career. Don't get me wrong, there were women who did that. It just wasn't common, right? As I got older, it got better, but when I graduated high school, we still had the fallback of, I'm looking to marry somebody and find a house and have children, and I was my attitude of, I want an apartment and a couple of cats, and I don't want any kids, and I'm not going to get married. When I sat down and told friends that, like at 12 years old, when I tell you that it was like, I was like blowing people's faces off saying stuff like that. At 12 years old, like nobody could understand what I was talking about. Yeah, I don't really want any of that. Like that kind of isn't my thing. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't a complete no for me. It was just like I had a vision of a couple of cats and a cool apartment and a cool job. And I did that. That's all stuff that I did It was what I wanted. But I had friends who at 12, 10, 11, 12, when we all sat around and talked about our futures, they just thought I was insane. They didn't know what I was talking about. What do you mean? You don't want to have kids? You don't want to find a guy and get married? Like, are you out of your mind? And I was like, well, maybe, So that was how I handled it. But again, I would say that I'm the minority and I'm the exception in a lot of cases, so I'm not surprised by that, and it's never changed over the years. But a lot of girls I went to school with, that's what they did. There was somebody that they married either out of high school or very soon after, and they got degrees, and degrees were like, well, I want to do this because this is something I'm interested in and I'd like to get a degree in this, and they kind of had, I'm going to say, like the freedom to take time and pursue that degree, but it wasn't like, I've got to get this degree because I need to get this job there was no urgency to it. However, a lot of them found that the degrees came in handy because they typically did not stay with the first husband, which is, when you look back at it now, not surprising because of the youth of getting married to somebody at 18, 19, 20. I mean, you really honestly don't, you're not who you are yet. So the person you're marrying makes sense now, but in 2 or 3 years, you change so much when you're that age that you're bound to grow apart from somebody like that. And there are marriages, people who do get married, they date as teens and they get married in high school and they stay together. But that was much more common in the 50s and 60s because in the 50s and 60s, marriage and love wasn't, you look at marriage over the years, marriage was more of a business arrangement. It was a status arrangement. There were times where marriage was a barter. I have a daughter, you have 4 cows. Well, we need cows over here on this farm. We don't have cows, but we have a daughter. So if we marry your daughter to your son, can you give us the cows and we'll give you the daughter? And that sounds silly, but there was a point in time where there was dowry and all that. And right, so daughters were married off to like accumulate family status and to accumulate living better, that was years ago. So marriage wasn't always love, love, love and romance and all that. I think we, of course, as Americans or as human beings, I guess, created a situation where we made marriage into a love and romance thing. But it really wasn't always like that. It was more of a business deal. It was an arrangement. Like, I want our daughter to have your family's last name. That gives us power. That gives us status. That raises us in the community as a family. So a lot of that kind of thing went on. And that's where you see, families like the Astors and the Vanderbilts and that kind of thing. That was at one point, a last name was extremely important. It was extremely powerful in the community you were in to get what you needed to get or to be, societally accepted. We hope you enjoyed part 1 of Reminiscing with Logic, Social Issues. We'll be back with part 2 next week. See you soon. Hey, you just listened to Love and Life with Lana and Dave. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please share the podcast, leave us a comment or review, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new content. We'll see you soon.